Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore. We're pleased to welcome Diane Seuss in support of Frank Sonnets and in conversation with Jeff Schatz this evening. First, a quick overview of webinars for those of you who are just joining us. The chat is closed, but you may want to keep the chat window open during the events, as I will be dropping links to purchase Frank Sonnets from Literati. There's also a link to purchase books in the description below if you're watching us later on YouTube. And if you're watching us live, of course, you can submit any questions you have for a Q&A portion that we'll have time for at the conclusion of the conversation at any time using the webinar's Q&A feature. And I will read a selection of those questions. As a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup if you live in Southeast Michigan, or to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And in lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. So whether you'd like to think of that as this week's or this month's or this year's subscription to our programming, you can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us from. And now I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Diane Seuss is the author of Frank Sonnets, Still Life with Two Dead Peacocks, and A Girl, Four-Legged Girl, and a finalist for Pulitzer Prize, and Wolf Lake, White Gown Blown Open, winner of the Juniper Prize. She lives in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And joining her this evening, Jeff Schatz is the executive editor for Graywolf Press and oversees Graywolf's poetry lists. They cannot hear you, but they can hear your raucous applause through the power of the internet. They can sense it, rather. So please join me in welcoming Jeff Schatz and Diane Seuss into your living rooms.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Thank you, Literati Bookstore. And thank you to everybody who was able to be here this evening. All my friends and family members who have supported me through living Frank and writing Frank. I can't express deeply enough my appreciation to Graywolf Press and Jeff Schatz, who has worked with me now through 3 books. It's very intimate work and very careful work. Jeff somehow managed to bring a combination of honesty and tenderness to our working relationship. He's made it possible for me to take bigger risks in my work. And that's more than I ever imagined. So thank you. Finally, I want to thank my son, Dylan, for our conversations that ended up in collaborative poems in this book. We've achieved a friendship, and I'm so glad. And if my sister's listening, thank you for being my sister. She was there for it all. And you know how that goes with a sibling. She knows where the bodies are buried, literally. So I'm going to read a poem from a few of the sequences in the book. The way the book is set up, there are no, sections per se, but there are sort of movements in the book, like a big piece of music. And I'm going to read the opening and closing poems, and then various examples of where I go between those two. So this is the opening poem, and it's the first thing I wrote for this book, and it describes pretty much what was going on in my mind as it's sort of in the present moment of the writing. I drove all the way to Cape Disappointment, but didn't have the energy to get out of the car. Rental, blue Ford, Focus. I had to stop in a semi-public place to pee on the ground. just squatted there on the roadside. I don't know what's up with my bladder. I pee and then I have to pee and pee again. Instead of sightseeing, I climbed into the back seat of the car and took a nap. I'm a little like Frank O'Hara without the handsome nose and penis and the New York school and Larry Rivers. Paid for a day pass at Cape Disappointment, thinking hard about that long drop from the lighthouse to the sea. Thought about going into the Ocean Medical Center for a checkup. But how do I explain this restless search for beauty or relief? This is from a sequence I did of poems kind of about music under the influence of Kurt Rohde, who's a musician and composer and friend. There's a certain state of grace that is not loving. Music, Kurt says, is not a language, though people say it is. Even poetry, though built from words, is not a language. The words are the lacy gown. The something else is the bride who can't be factored down even to her flesh and bones. I wore my own white dress, my hair a certain way, and looked into the mirror to get my smile right. And then into my own eyes. It's rare to really look. And saw I was making a fatal mistake. That's the poem. But went through with it anyway. That's the music. Spent years in a graceful detachment. Now silence is my lover. It does not embrace me when I wake, or it does, but its embrace is neutral, like God or Switzerland since 1815. This is a sonnet from the place where I was raised. And some of the language I actually got from a Facebook page that is for people who grew up there and like looking back. The white rabbit was before the high rise, bras stuffed with socks. You can hear it in the breeze, boys wanted boobs. Cattails hammered the wind. Mr. K is too fancy. Remember Satan's Inn, bout beat a bitch's ass on the pool table. Glass floor lit up red back then. Mansion changed into a hospital, gazebo across from the Catholics. Remember Joe Savage and his snake act, Mrs. Funk. Remember the whorehouse by the depot back when it still had a ticket window. Nobody cared their teeth were small and green. Where was Pecker's Pond? Where was Penis Rock? Who remembers the mustache Betty wore to the men's side of the wire factory? Chandel, who died mysterious. Remember cancer clusters on Pucker Road? Something wrong with the wells, dumped cyanide in a pit and built over it. Brown cloud. When Bill dove and broke his neck, people thought he was playing drowned. Who shimmied, soul kissed, French inhaled, jerked. River drank Wonderland and the Button Factory. Since the flooding, everything's a blur. Was all there was, and was what we were. If you hear a gnashing sound, it's my dog eating a bone. this poem is from a sequence that takes place in good old New York, New York. Sort of. It's sort of a confluence of New York and home. I should have been in cinema. I should have been in paint or founded a band. I am certain of nothing, said the tattoo. Where is home? Scratched the chickens. I should have met the Stones when I had the chance. Should have let Keith turn me inside out. So what if I ended up dead or crazy? I am big, but this feeling is bigger, the silo whispered. I am a movie screen, drawled the pasture. I should have kept the baby. So what, poverty? I could have loved the little fox-faced punk. I am buxom, breathed the prairie. I should have taken the radical path. I should have gone the cheerleader's way. Should have married Chuck before he enlisted. What if I'm a star, said the lamb. A star, said the ham. A star, said the duck. A star, said the truck. A star, said the star. Is this music about sound and not notes? What if it broadcasts a shimmering? So the Jello in this poem is Jello Biafra of the Dead Kennedys, that punk band. I can't say I love punk when punk was contagious. CBGB nearly every night at the behest of my boyfriend. Mud Club. I lived within punk's borders. There was no escape from its thesis. It manifested in style and music, everything that was unfolding in my daily life. Chaos, rage, snot, vomit, junk, dissonance, black eyes, noise unmediated by music. It was no more liberated than what had come before. And what had come before that? Face it, jazz was the liberation. The blues was liberation. The rest was the same old dangerous white boy song and dance, unaware of its misogyny and convinced that its dangers were innovational and had the power to uncap the revolution, which, had it come, would have proven to be a profound disappointment, for they would have lost their supremacy, their faux fiery crowns. Even decades later, when I had a chance to maybe hook up with Jello after his monologue concert, I found myself unable to sit through the oxygen robbing eternity of his diatribe and left early. I heard he ended the night eating pancakes just off I-94 at a Denny's on the east side of Kalamazoo. This is kind of from a section on injury, on sort of suffering in the body. And poems range in here from really concrete storytelling to, I'd say, more rhetorical poems. And this one leans in that rhetorical direction. There is a force that breaks the body, inevitable. The byproduct is pain, unexceptional as a rain gauge, which has become arcane. Rhyme likewise, unless it's assonant or internal injury. Gloom, joy, which is also a dish soap, but not the one that rids seabirds of oil from wrecked tankers. That's dawn, which should change its name to dusk. Irony being the flip side of sentimentality here in the Iron Age. Ironing out the kinks in despair, turning it to hairdo from hair. To do, vexing infinitive. Much better to be pain's host, body of Christ, as opposed to the Holy Ghost. When I have been suffering at times, I could step away from it by embracing it. A blues thing, a John Donne thing. Divest by wrestling, then sing. There's another segment of Frank that is that takes on addiction. And I find myself needing the music of the sonnet more when I take on addiction. Where's the drug to drug this feeling out of me? The drug to drug away the fear of drugs and what they steal from me or stole from me. Sometimes love, and then my sanity. The frozen bowling ball that set up shop inside my gut and liked it there and never went away. I never went away for fear of losing what I left, which was itself a kind of hell. The hell of being terrified, of swapping hell for hell. My son fucked up, rolled his car in dark Ohio, lay inside the ditch and listened to the crickets. Even grass, he said to me, he could hear it growing, and corn, all of it just trying to get by. As close as he could come, he said to God. And I was such a fool, believing in fruition, stuck inside the fairy tale of resurrection. Even stars, he said, are trying to get by. And then he used for 10 more years and bankruptcy. And where's the melody to remedy the melody, the remedy to remedy the remedy? There's a lot of death in poetry, in mine anyway, I think in most. How will I leave this life? Like I left my job, drifting off without comment. Like mother took off to get schooled, shut the door hard on my crying. She had books to read. Or father in an ambulance, rotating lights swept red over oak trees. Then the hospital bed, hallucinating warship and sea. Or the way my ex left us, dragging his clothes in a garbage bag through snow like fresh kill. Or like I left Kev, I had 20 minutes before he'd get home to try to change my mind or kill me. Out of the red door with my dad's briefcase full of all my poems and the typewriter and sealskin coat. And then the airplane home, so freaked by the years with him in New York, I broke when I stirred up a grouse in the woods. Will I leave like a grouse leaves, drumming the air with its wings? Or like Freddie left the stage when Queen played Live Aid, gloss like a racehorse, top of his game? Or like I leave parties, no valedictions, out the door, like smoke from extinguished candelabras. The person on the cover of the book is my friend, Mikkel, who died in the 80s of AIDS. And there's a whole sequence of poems about us and him. I saw a little movie of a person stroking a small bird with two Q-tips, one held between the forefinger and thumb of each hand. It tipped back its head to receive the minor tenderness, which to the bird must have felt like being touched by God. For a moment, I knew what it would feel like to be at the mercy of love, small scale, the kind shown but not spoken of. I was afraid to touch you. I was afraid of the lesions you described to me over the phone, their locations and the measurement in centimeters of each. Jesus marks, you called them. Also, I would be prepared and unafraid, or less afraid, but still I was afraid of dying like you were dying. When I first arrived, I looked so long into your eyes, you shivered and ordered me to look away. You were imperious in your dying, yet courtly about my fear. You understood, as if I were a child afraid of lightning storms, which I am, having at age 10 been struck. Out of the blue, you said that once you were dead, I'd never be able to listen to Blue again, Joni Mitchell's Blue. Not just the song, but the whole album. It was a minor curse you lay across my shoulders, like a fur dyed blue. And so I listen now in defiance of you. And the listening, the pronoun shifts. We are listening. There is no death. And two more. You know what living means? Tits out, tits in the rain, tits in the cereal bowl, tits ablaze. What beauty there was is now on the wane. I've seen beauty tinkle in the spring, its little breeze-born bells. Summer's copper gong, heat frizzing the wisteria until all that's left is rat hair. Winter, I think they're ice flutes. I think blue lips of killed kids blow cold notes from ice flutes. You know what living's for? Tits, sacrosanct, declined. Tits blued by cold, insomnia, midnight, indigoed like collapsed veins. Steel blue stained pillowcase of the crone whose nightie won't be pulled up anymore. I saw my tits when I was young, reflected back to me in a blue mirror on which were laid out lines of coke. Even then they were old, savant tits, they knew things, purpled, milked out, mounded low, and moving slow in the old way. And the last poem in the book. I hope when it happens, I have time to say, oh, so this is how it's happening. Unlike Frank, hit by a Jeep on Fire Island, but not like Dad, who knew too long, 6 goddamn years in a young man's life, so long it made a sweet guy sarcastic. I want enough time to say, oh, so this is how I'll go, and smirk at that last rhyme. I rhymed at times because I wanted to make something pretty, especially for Mikkel, who liked pretty things, soft and small things, who cried into a white towel when I hurt myself. When it happens, I don't want to be afraid. I want to be curious. Was Mikkel curious? I'm afraid by then he was only sad. He had no money left, was living on green oranges, had kissed all his friends goodbye. I kissed lips that kissed Frank's lips, though not for me, a willing kiss. I willingly kissed lips that kissed Howard's deathbed lips. I happily kissed lips that kissed Basquiat's lips. I know a man who said he kissed lips that kissed lips that kissed lips that kissed lips that kissed Whitman's lips. Who will say of me I kissed her? Who will say of me I kissed someone who kissed her, or I kissed someone who kissed someone who kissed someone who kissed her. Thanks for listening. Jeff?
Diane, that was really magnificent. That last sonnet, I've heard you read it before, and of course I've read it and lived it and felt it, but every time it's just such a remarkable particular poem inside this book. Thank you so much for launching this book, for being with us at Graywolf, for your kindness and brilliance in everything that you do. We've just been so proud at Graywolf to be your publisher for these last 3 books and to see this Frank out into the world at last. It's such an honor for me to get to work with you as your editor and get to talk with you tonight, and then we can turn things over to the Q&A with the audience after a bit. But I'm hoping there's a little chance for us to talk recklessly for a little bit, and then is there any other way with you? That last sonnet, there's something about the kissing of the lips that kissed the lips that kissed the lips, that kind of echo across time, and it just feels to me, here we are on screen in this pandemic moment, and just what a beautiful statement of proximity that is. What a longed for wish that even in the final moments that we're interconnected. I mean, it just feels like we read that poem and we read this book differently inside the time that you wrote it. Do you think so, or do you feel that there in your red painted house?
I do. I mean, I started the book obviously before the pandemic, and then it kind of followed me through all kinds of travel. There's a lot of travel in the book, as you know, and teaching and, losing things and gaining them. But I think, my whole life has sort of been like a pandemic. I've been thinking about that a lot. To go into connection has always felt, since I was a kid, like a pretty dangerous act. You're always risking annihilation when you connect. And also, though, without that connection, you're dead. And I like Keats' notion in his little poem, This Living Hand, now warm and capable of earnest grasping. When he's on his deathbed, he's angry at the future reader, and he really wants their lifeblood so he can live again. This last poem isn't angry in that way, but it does ask to be a part of a lineage. And I think being who I am, what I am, where I'm from, to step into any kind of literary lineage seems pretty daunting. Mm-hmm. And so my connection, I guess, is through kissing.
Well, and through poetry. I mean,
yeah.
I mean,
really, the sonnets are a series of kisses.
Yeah. And it's so, intriguing to me you've rearranged, our notion of what the sonnet is and what the sonnet can be and do in this book. I mean, it's a revelation. You've employed the sonnet in a way that I haven't seen before. And, one of those ways is that, you've kind of joked, joked and not joked that, this book is as close as you're likely to write, a memoir, mm-hmm. of your life in a way. Not that it's a straightforward, chronology by any stretch, but why did you, what brought you to the sonnet to tell your life's story, the story of your survival, the story of those kisses?
Well, like every book I've ever written, so much just comes serendipitously. And I was at a residency on the West Coast, and I did drive to Cape Disappointment. Yeah. And as I was driving back, I was sort of narrating to myself, which we do, right? And I thought, I drove all the way to Cape Disappointment, where the past and the present were really close there. And then Frank stepped in, and I'm kind of like Frank O'Hara, except without this and that and the penis and the, and so really everything, sort of all of the ideas in the book are present in that first poem. I got back to the cottage thing and I wrote it out, and it's in 14. I can make it 14 lines. And then I thought, this is a language that I can write something like a memoir, but it's a memoir that, because it's song, structure and song, it allows me to think through ideas of what memory is and how we remember and what is worth remembering and the strangeness of what we remember. So it's less incidental, this happened, than it is how do I remember and how do I language that? And the sonnet just seemed a really good package. It kept me in line. It kept me from falling off the edge of the page. It provided me with strong boundaries. And I like this idea that anything I turn my attention to, from, a molecule to God, is 14 lines. It's sort of the great leveler. Everything takes up the same amount of space. And I like that. So there's not kind of an arc in the traditional sense. Every poem holds its space and gets equal time.
That seems so essential to your project as a writer. I mean, up to Frank sonnets. I mean, I just think about the way that the sonnet form, at least kind of traditionally, as a sort of high lyric form of argumentation. I mean, you called out John Donne, for example, in the poem that you read tonight, for example, and traditionally, the sonnet is, reaching out toward, beauty and God and the spirit and the soul and those metaphysical arguments that Donne was especially known for. But, and then, I think about that last poem, the last sonnet again with the kisses, and the idea that the sonnet can somehow imbue a kind of eternity, imbue a kind of eternalness to, impermanent things.
Yes.
Like a kiss or like a lover. I'm struck though that through Frank's sonnets, you're using this really traditional form to argue that in fact, the sonnet has for centuries left out a lot of people and a lot of places.
Yes.
Talk more about that. And I mean, you seem like you're very, some of that has to do with place, some of that has to do with class, some of that has to do with gender.
Yep. Yeah. I think I talked with someone recently about the fact that, the sonnet was seen as high end and patriarchal.
Yeah.
And just through my practicing it, it becomes, in ways, it allows for the low end and the matriarchal, which is what I'm from for the most part. So, I guess one of my goals with the book was to open space for practitioners who might have been intimidated by a form that for so many centuries kept them out, and that we can make it ours. And that doesn't mean it can be anything. I mean, there's one thing I love about it is that there's a kind of discipline to it, which is part of why it's beautiful. And that discipline you can push against, you can resist, you can play into, but it's learnable. And I keep thinking of this Sharon Olds line in a poem where she talks about Whitman. It's called The Language of the Brag. And Whitman and Ginsberg and those dudes. And she said, and I'm putting myself right here with the rest of them. And I think that's what the last poem is. That's really, I can walk into that territory. And by I mean we.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and especially thinking about, I mean, you didn't read so many of these tonight, but there is a thread across, really your previous book, Still Life with Two Dead Peacocks and a Girl, and thinking about art, visual art, but also in Frank sonnets and thinking about poetry and the sonnet form in particular, that is really what you're saying, a kind of inclusion, but also a very sharp retort to the male gaze.
Yes.
Which I think the sonnet, in particular of any poetic form I can think of, has kind of perpetrated that particular male gaze. I mean, was that part of your intention of that kind of suite of poems in Frank?
Yeah, certainly. And I mean, I talk very directly about the male gaze, especially in the literary world when I was coming up, when I was young, and just how difficult it was to be in that light and still persist to keep writing. Because for the most part, with some really important exceptions, that gaze was very destructive to many of us. There's a lot of women, obviously, and people of color, obviously, who just, who were silenced forever by that atmosphere. And so anything I write, I consider a kind of victory, like I pushed through that. And I feel that about a lot of contemporary poetry, a lot of what you publish, we pushed through that and are now being heard.
Yeah, no, it's a really powerful thread across your works, but I think it reaches its height in Frank sonnets for sure. One of the things, and you kind of touched on it in your reading, Diane, that I just, every time I think about the book, every time I open the book, every time I hear you read from it, you ended up ordering this book essentially in the order of composition.
Yes.
I mean, what a remarkable, what a rare kind of feat to kind of have that start at Cape Disappointment and then end with the kisses with Basquiat and Whitman and yourself. I mean, why did you decide to kind of hold? I mean, you could have shaped these sonnets in virtually any way that you wanted to. Why hold to that compositional framework? I mean,
well, it seemed really important, and maybe this is a Frank O'Hara influence. I like interacting with writers from the past and artists from the past, and in a sort of nettling, but also a learning or a mentorship, I guess, of the imagination. And O'Hara had that here I am walking down the street kind of poem, it's kinetic and it's happening right now. And so I like the spontaneity of his poems and that kind of thinking, writing as you think something through. And so that really was my goal, my aesthetic goal. And so then it seemed kind of counter to that purpose to somehow shape in the book into a Grecian urn of some kind. Like I liked this, and I did write sequences, so they did hang together. I got obsessed with lambs or with the blood in my hometown or whatever, and so I would write poems in that. They built on each other, so I didn't think it would be too chaotic, and it didn't seem to be. And then I had it in sections when I gave it to you first, and you sort of kindly said, you remove those, Diane, which was the perfect thing. The danger of making a book, one of them is that you do what you did. And I need to always challenge that. And I usually am pretty good at challenging that. That's why I wrote short for Frank, because I'd written longer poems before. And now that I'm in love with the sonnet, I'm not letting myself have it. And I'm writing really long stuff just to see what will happen. So I think we have to challenge ourselves that way. But this is where an editor steps in and protects you from yourself.
I hope so, or at least and get out of the way when the editor needs to. One of the things though, Diane, even in this compositional field, even in this compositional organization of the book, I mean, you do have these kind of, I call them suites or little groupings that kind of eddy. It's almost river-like, you kind of eddy for a while and then you move into a different territory. So you have, the group of poems about your childhood or your father, the death of your father. And then, Mickle, who you mentioned, who's on the cover of the book, and caring for him and his last days in illness. And there's a real heart of the book is this suite of poems or this grouping of poems with your son, with Dylan, who has written one of the sonnets, or that you've credited him in your notes of that he wrote and gave permission to include that sonnet. And then, of course, there's 7 or 8 other poems that are essentially transcribed conversations about, Billy Idol, for example,
and Elvis,
and right, and Jesus, and so on.
A lot of Jesus. Yeah.
I mean, it's such a beautiful act of generosity and motherhood, I think, to kind of give a piece of your book, quite literally. How did that come into the sequence? How did that come into that sense of grouping in this book?
Yeah, well, obviously he's such a core part of my life. And he's a person, because of what he's been through, who would most often be outside the margins of a book. And so again, it was that instinct to include, but also our conversations are so, to me, interesting and funny. And I thought, I just tried transcribing some of them and putting them into lines, and I really liked how they sounded. So it wasn't really me being a good guy. It was me wanting to use his great ideas and just his existential wit, which is, part of me, but different from me. And since, I talk about him a lot. What would happen if he can kind of talk back?
Mhm.
And that seemed important. So for those who don't have the book yet, there's a centerfold with a really wide-lined piece that I wrote, about throwing some crackheads, look at that, out of his apartment. And then the backside is a piece that Dill wrote about sort of disability and speaking of his own life and his own language. And it felt particularly important to have sort of the other side of the coin exist in the book. Somebody else's addiction isn't all about me. And so that felt pretty crucial. And I mean, my mom has one of the, like a sonnet is a mother, and her saying a wish in one hand and shit in another. And, that became sort of the aesthetic statement of the book. So it's bringing in the voices that otherwise would be floating around out there.
Well, thank you so much, Diane. Thanks for your reading.
Good questions, Jeff, as usual.
Thanks for talking a little recklessly, and thanks to John at Literati and for hosting us. And we'll turn it over to you, John.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you both for just a beautiful reading, Diane, and such a lovely conversation. I'm so glad to have you both here. We do have some questions from the audience. I want to get to as many as possible. Barry writes, when/how did you fall in love with the sonnet form? Have there been times you have tried to abandon it and couldn't?
Yes, I'm in that time. I find it, there's been sort of a grief period of letting it go, because it just, practicing it connected me kiss to kiss with so many writers of the past. And it just fit me so sweetly that it was hard to let go. And I'm still struggling with how I can sound outside of that. What will be the boundary now? I fell in love just by reading them from writers of the past and being fed by those, and then practicing them and seeing just all of the capabilities of that form and what I could do with it.
A viewer writes in, if you can talk more about the risks Jeff encouraged you to take.
Oh, well, I've written an essay recently in which I talk about this a little bit, that Emily Dickinson, she wrote to a mentor she sort of selected out of the somebody that she had read. He was an editor and a writer. And she asked, could he tell her if her poems were alive? And he didn't give her a really great answer. But having him out there, I think, was very important. And it's been very important for me to just have a companion in, the writing itself is so alone. And then to have a person, you're not writing for them, but I think I said in my essay, you're writing toward them. And you trust them to tell you when you're off key as well as on. And so that to have a Jeff is like having a form. If you have a form, it keeps you honest, it keeps you boundaried. And to have a Jeff is the same thing for me.
Bill writes, Hey, Evil Bill here.
Oh, Evil
O2.
Bill. Yeah.
Love you, of course. Question: what is poetry's responsibility? What must it tell us? What can it tell us about what we're going through right now? What can it tell us about this void, this failure, this loss?
Mm. Oh, what a hard, big question. Actually, I've been writing essays and I've been thinking about that question. What can poetry be now? But I don't think we're special in facing this void, this loss. Many artists through time, through history, have faced a lot more discomfort and a lot more devastation, even though we're facing, great deal of devastation. And also what the last 4 years did to many of our souls to live with that fascism. And so I'm still working out, Evil Bill, how we respond to that beyond. I don't think we can write as if it isn't happening or as if it didn't happen. I think anything we write now, just like anything I write, is going to involve loss and class and gender and all those things that make me. Anything we write will have to take this into consideration, and how that sounds and how each writer solves that for themselves. I think, I never write a poem that I already know the answer to. If I know where I'm going, forget it, why write it? And so I think for those who are writing right now, it's just even a bigger part of an even bigger mystery that we have to walk into.
Thank you. We have just two more questions. Margaret
Okay,
writes,
thanks.
are Barryman Sonnets something you like? They're so lyrical. He's from the Midwest. They're about sex and love, but also, of course, he's one of the famous poets.
Yeah, he is. I mean, perfect example of somebody who both inspired me and nettles me. Um, and his, I listened to him reading. There's some videos of him reading, and I'm really moved by some of those. And then some of them are, not good or problematic in various ways. But a lot of mine are problematic too. So yes, I do love Barryman's sonnets. And I love what he did with it. And I'd love to, talk with him about it. Too bad I can't.
We have one more question. I think it's a good one to end on. Sophia writes, how does writing help you decide, quote, what is worth remembering?
Mm. Hmm. That's another thing I've been writing about lately. I have a essay I'm working on called "The Shit I Remember," because a lot of what I remember is just shit. When you think, I remember my father, not at all. I don't remember his voice. I don't remember his gestures. I don't remember his love. But I remember being at his funeral and watching people's faces when they cried and thinking it was strange, or seeing an ant crawling across a rose. I think maybe that is the birth of metaphor, when the experience is so overwhelming that you have to focus on a detail. In Shrinkville, we might call that dissociation. But I think maybe metaphor is a kind of dissociative thing, that ends up standing in for a feeling that is too big, for us to contend with in another way. So what's worth remembering? Anything you remember is worth remembering. What's worth bringing into a poem is the next question. And you can only know that by doing the work and doing the writing, seeing what calls to you. I write whatever is in front of me. And if what is in front of me is a question about what is worth remembering, that's what I write. I walk into that question.
Well, we've reached the top of the hour.
We
Diane
have.
Seuss, Jeff Schatz, thank you so much for joining us tonight on At Home with Literati. It's really a pleasure to have you both and to launch this book. Of course, you can purchase it at our bookstore, and the link in the chat, and there's also a link in the description below. If you're watching us later on YouTube. Dan and Jeff, I hope to have you both in the bookstore sometime in the not too distant future, but until then, continue to be safe and well. And to all of our attendees, thank you for joining us. We hope you continue to be safe and stay well, and we'll see you at the next event. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Good night, all.